All right, Q&A again. We're question number 12 and 13 tonight. And our first question tonight, what time Sunday morning did Jesus come out of the tomb? Don't know if that's something that you had ever wondered about or thought about before. But that was the main question that was submitted. And I thought in addition to that, I would add another common question that surrounds the resurrection events. And how do we actually count 3 days if Jesus went in the tomb on Friday night, probably sometime a little bit before 6 o'clock. And then we have all day Saturday, which that's 24 hours, plus 6 hours on Friday. So we're at about 30 hours then. And thinking that he rose before sunrise on Sunday morning. So that's maybe another 6 hours possible on Sunday. So you're talking about 36 hours there that from the time that he was put in the tomb to the time he's out of the tomb. And so how do we figure that that's 3 days? I mean, who's counting this? So how are we going to put that together? So let's figure these things out together, at least as much as we can, the way the Bible's going to put them together for us. First of all, let's go through a little bit of a timeline of what happened on Good Friday. This is an illustration from, it's called the NIV Quick View Bible. I just happened to see this posted on Twitter a couple times on this past Friday, on Good Friday. People posted it, and I thought it was interesting. So I had it in the back of my mind, and then I got this question that came in just this week. And I was like, let me go back and find that diagram, because I thought it was pretty cool. And it starts really, the clock on Friday really starts right here at 8 a.m. Pilate condemns Jesus to death. It says, let me zoom in here a little bit for you so you can see. 8 a.m., Pilate condemns Jesus to death. Now these are, they don't have Timex, atomic synchronized watches at this point. They're going, some of these are estimates and generalizations from the gospel accounts and what happened. But we do have from the 3rd hour, from the 6th hour, some general descriptions about what time it was. Now, like I said, we're not talking about scientific accuracy or precision. I should say, we're not talking about scientific precision, though these descriptions are no doubt accurate in what they're saying. So about 8 o'clock is when Pilate gives the order. 9 o'clock is when Jesus is crucified and actually put on the cross, about this time. So it's during the morning time that he is crucified and on the cross. About noon is the time that the sky grows dark. Darkness covers the land, Matthew 27:45, from the time of about noon to about 3 o'clock. So you've got 3 hours there, 6 hours total, approximately, of Jesus actually being on the cross, with Jesus dying at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, you remember that they wanted to take his body down from the cross and get it buried before the Sabbath, which was Saturday. So this is Friday afternoon we're talking about. The Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday evening. They don't count their days from midnight to midnight. They go from sundown is when the next day starts, and then the day lasts until the next sundown. So 6, 7 o'clock at sundown is when the Sabbath is beginning. So they get Jesus' body and they put it in Joseph's tomb, and they roll the stone in front of it. 6 o'clock is kind of our end point for when that may have happened. May have happened a little bit earlier than that, possibly a little bit later, but most likely earlier than that. So that gives us a time for when Jesus is actually put in the tomb. Then he remains there for the rest of that night, all day Saturday. How do we know that he remained in the tomb on Saturday? And that's kind of where the gist of this question came from. I had to condense it a little bit to fit it on the slide. But the question kind of got at well, how do we know he was actually in the tomb during that time? How do we know he didn't come out at some point on Saturday or another time? Now, from a practical standpoint, what we would say is, well, the tomb was very likely still closed at that point, because if the stone had been rolled away by that time, then the soldiers would have known something was going on. They wouldn't have been surprised Sunday morning, like some of the gospel accounts show that they are surprised Sunday morning when the stone is rolled away. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because we'll find out that the stone isn't necessarily rolled away to allow Jesus to come out. Now, here's a little bit different angle that you may not be aware of, but we'll talk about that as we get into the details a little bit. But we have 6 p.m. Friday. Jesus is in the tomb, very likely all day Saturday. And then Sunday morning is when the empty tomb is discovered. So let's see, how does this work? How do we actually get 3 days from that? Let's answer that question first, because that's actually a little bit easier. The answer is that during Bible times, they count days very often inclusively. So even if you have part of a day, and even a very just short part of a day, it still counts as a full day. That's basically how it works. And some of it actually comes into play and is helpful to remember that we're talking about the first day, the second day, and the third day, not necessarily, that's not worded in a way that necessarily means it has to be 24 hours. Now, the way that we think about first day, 3 days, we're thinking, okay, that's got to be 72 hours. We start counting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then wrap around to 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. That's 1 day. But that's not the way that they normally talked about days and counted days during this time period. So we have to allow, this is one of the hermeneutical principles that we use, principles for interpreting the Bible, is that we read the Bible according to the way that it would have been normally written in the historical context that it was written. So the way they counted days was inclusively. So Friday afternoon, Jesus dies and is buried at the end of the day, before the end of the day. So that's the first day. Friday is the first day that he's in the tomb. Now, like I said, it's not a full 24-hour period, but it's still the first day according to the way that they counted things in the Bible. Now, the Saturday, Jesus' body remains in the tomb. That's the second day. Jesus rises from the dead on the third day. So this Sunday is the third day, even though it's not a full 24-hour day. It's not, 6 p.m. to match a 72-hour day like we were talking about, but it's still the third day that Jesus is resurrected, and he exits the tomb early morning, is all we know, because they discovered the empty tomb at sunrise, basically. So this is how we get Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, even though we're not talking about 72 hours from a stopwatch standpoint. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It does sound a little bit confusing when you first start thinking about it, but when you understand the way that ancient cultures counted days, then it makes a lot more sense to understand that Jesus rose on the third day.
And Jesus did a parable about the workers being paid a full day wage even for just a couple hours of work. So I guess that would give credence to the fact that just a part of the day was considered a full day.
Potentially, but also in that parable you have the workers that did work the full day are upset about it. So that the guys that came later in the day were still paid a full day's wage. So I'm not sure that would. But Jesus does talk about Jonah being in the, being in the whale 3 days and 3 nights. So that one goes a little bit more toward the okay, well, why don't we have 3 full days here? But it becomes just one of those situations where we don't want to push the analogy and the metaphor too far that it's going to collapse under its own weight. But that the Son of Man would rise on the third day is language that occurs frequently in the Gospels, and that's what we see happening. So when did the resurrection actually happen? That's kind of more generally what the first question was getting at. What time did it happen? Was it just before the women arrived at the tomb? Or was it maybe 3 o'clock in the morning? Or maybe, who knows, maybe sometime Saturday, and Jesus was resurrected from all that time. Now, I don't think so, because the Bible does talk about him rising on the third day. So I think that eliminates the idea that he would have risen on Saturday at any point. But Sunday starts at sundown on Saturday evening. So potentially could be what we would call late Saturday night or very early Sunday morning, 1, 2, 3 in the morning. Could be possibilities. Let's see if any of these accounts give us a clue to how it works. So let's look at Matthew first. Somebody like to read Matthew 27:66 through 28:7.
So they went and made a tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. After the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you."
Now, this is one of the more extensive accounts of what actually happened. Do we have an account of Jesus rising from the dead here in Matthew? No, we don't. It doesn't actually tell us what happened. Did he wake up slowly, or did he kind of pop up with a big gasp of air? We don't know exactly how it happened. It's not, at least not in Matthew's account, but we got 3 more gospel accounts. Maybe we'll find out some more details about Jesus' actual resurrection in one of those. So just while we're here in Matthew, Ernie was talking about some possible different days of the week, but we have pretty clear here after the Sabbath and on the first day of the week, described here pretty clearly in Matthew. So I think that secures our view of Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Matthew uses a little bit of irony in the fact that the guards are now like dead men versus Jesus, who was a dead man who is now alive, although it's not described here. But they shook and became like dead men is pretty vivid visual imagery that Matthew gives there. What we're really seeing here is the angel coming down, the miraculous event of the angel rolling back the stone, sitting on it, his appearance. The angel speaks to the women. The guards are afraid, but we don't even know at this point. At this point, it doesn't even tell us that he rolled the stone away so that Jesus could come out of the tomb. In fact, the impression that we're left with is that Jesus is actually already out of the tomb, and that the stone is rolled away, not so that Jesus can exit, but so that the people who come later can actually look in and see that it's really empty. So there's the potential here that the stone being rolled away is not for the resurrection, because we know later on Jesus appears and disappears in a locked room, and when he's talking with people as well. So the resurrected Jesus, even though he has a physical body that he eats with and people can touch and see his wounds and things like that, even though it is a real physical body in the same way that we think of a physical body, there are some ways that this physical body is not bound by the same laws of nature that we are, by being able to teleport or something like that. Basically what we're talking about here. They're in a locked room in John's gospel, and Jesus appears there. And this is the physical Jesus that he's going to tell Thomas to touch the wounds in my hands, in my side. So, all right, well, let's look at Mark and see if that sheds a little bit more light on our question. Mark 15:47 through 16:6. This will sound familiar from Sunday morning. Somebody like to read that for us? (1547) through 16:6.
I'll read it. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him."
Yeah, thanks, Angela. So once again, very similar to the Matthew account, we don't actually have an account of Jesus rising from the dead, just that they went and found an empty tomb, and they talked to an angel that was there. All right? Let's look at Luke. Yeah? Question or follow-up on that one? Luke 23 and 24. Luke 23, beginning in verse 55. Let me read this one. 23:55 through 24:8. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you, with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. So very similar again. We have no account of the resurrection. They just go and they find the empty tomb. The account of talking with angels is a little bit different in this one. How?
There's two.
Yeah, there's 2. And this actually happens during a number of parallel gospel accounts. You'll have in one account talking with one person will be involved, in another account 2 people will be involved. And it presents a little bit of an interesting challenge in gospel harmonization. But here's the bottom line of it is that when Matthew and Mark say that they talked with one angel, that doesn't preclude the possibility of there being another one beside him, and maybe one of them talked more and was more prominent, so that was what they described. And that's most likely what was going on here. In this case, it's not, Matthew and Mark don't deny that there's a second one, they just don't mention it. So, gospel harmonization can be kind of a tricky thing, and sometimes we don't always know the exact answer. But we do know that when multiple people tell the same story, a lot of times the accounts, though accurate, may sound very different. And that's just what you're going to run into when you have multiple accounts of the same event. So that's the Luke account. Any questions or follow-up on that one? He's going to be raised on the third day, but we still have no account of his...
So, I just thought of something.
Yeah.
So in one account, they talked about the women went,
Right.
and then there was more women in another account.
Mm-hmm.
So they added some, or
Right.
not.
Yeah, that's just another situation where there was a group of women that went, and some of the gospel writers are just more
Named more,
selective
yeah, okay.
in who they name that went, and there were other ones going. Now let's look at the John account as well. Now this one really gets interesting on that question particularly, and John is kind of his own animal. The other 3 are called the Synoptic Gospels. A lot of times a lot more similar in their
Well, he was
stories
there.
and their content. But let's look at John 19:41 through 22. Somebody want to read those verses for us? John 19:41 through 22.
The place of crucifixion was near a garden where there was a new tomb, never used before. And so, because it was the day of preparation for the Jewish Passover, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. It's here too.
Mhm.
Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him."
Yeah, so then you have Peter and John running to the tomb. So it's a very different flavor for the account, but not necessarily contradictory to what the other ones have given. It's just a different perspective, choosing to emphasize different facts of the event. But once again, we have Jesus is laid in the tomb, and then the next verse, it's Sunday morning, and they're going to the tomb, and they're finding it empty. So the bottom line is we don't have an account of the actual resurrection. What we have an account of in all 4 Gospels is them going to find the empty tomb, and then we have accounts of Jesus interacting with people later in all the Gospels except for Mark, because Mark ends, I would argue, at Mark 16:8, before they meet the resurrected Christ. But Matthew, Luke, and John all report interactions with him afterwards. So we don't know exactly what Jesus' resurrection was like, or, in direct answer to this question, exactly what time it happened. It's possible that it happened pretty soon before the angel rolled the stone away. It's possible that it happened concurrently with it, and he did walk out of that the doorway of the tomb with the with the freshly opened door. That's possible. It's possible it happened several hours earlier, very, very early when it was still dark Sunday morning. Any of those are possibilities that the Bible leaves open to us. And the fact is we just don't know exactly what time that morning or what he would have done all that time, waiting around for them to find the empty tomb. What does he do? Just hang out and pray, maybe? I don't know. The Bible isn't written to satisfy all our curiosity about all these details. That's one of the things and in fact, it couldn't be because it would be so long. If it was going to fill out all of these details, it would be unmanageable to read. So that's kind of what we've got with this one. We don't know exactly what time he was resurrected. We don't know exactly what that resurrection looked like or what means it took. But we do know the tomb was empty, and we do know that Jesus' body, he was bodily resurrected from that tomb and continued on in that same body for 40 days until he ascended to heaven, as recorded in the opening paragraphs of the book of Acts. All right. Any follow-ups to that?
One of the passages, I was just trying to find out which one,
Mhm.
says something about an earthquake or the...
Right, the Matthew passage, I think.
Yeah, and that could be an indication of, when it happened.
Yeah, definitely.
Clearly.
Yeah, the Matthew account is probably the strongest in that vein. If we were going to argue that, okay, the resurrection is happening at the same time as the stone is being rolled away and the angels appearing, Matthew 28, there's a violent earthquake, and for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. So, it's possible the earthquake could just be because of the appearance of the angel, but it could be as well because that's the resurrection taking place. So our curiosity just isn't entirely satisfied on that one.
So if you keep reading in John, it talks about Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
That in John's account, Mary sees and talks to the angels after John and Peter have seen that Jesus isn't there. So does the fact that Jesus is all of a sudden right there, does that lend credence to the thought that maybe he did just get resurrected around that time, or did he
Possibly.
go off and do some other stuff that's not recorded and then he just pops up right next to her because,
I mean, it's possible because he does move, like on the road to Emmaus in Luke's account, he's walking with people who knew
all
him.
day pretty much. In that.
Yeah, and they didn't recognize him, so he must have looked somewhat different, but then other times people do recognize him. Here, she thinks he's the gardener. We don't know how closely she
Right,
looked
so
at him.
he could have been there the whole time. Peter and John went in and all these other people come by and nobody notices
Yeah.
him until he talks to Mary, so he
Mhm.
could have been there the whole
If
time.
I was him, I'd have got a cup of coffee. I think he was.
It was early in the morning,
Got some
so
warm up.
Yeah, that would you know.
yeah, Angela.
In you talking about it, it actually popped up another question, and we might have to say this for another day, but when you talk about him, when he resurrected, he still had the holes in his wrist or hands and
Mhm.
the side. And
Yeah.
even when we're resurrected, like if he were to come back, he's going to heal our bodies. Why didn't he get
Yeah, great question. And we don't have a firm answer to that, but I've heard some good speculation on it, and it's the main thing that people have surmised was that wounds from possibly persecution or martyrdom may remain as kind of a badge of honor or something like that, so that Jesus in this situation, his wounds remain to show that. And the martyrs in Revelation chapter 6, possibly they're allowed to keep those wounds as a testimony to their faithfulness. So that is that's just a kind of a wild guess that we don't know the answer to.
One of those curious questions, Kenny.
But
Exactly.
you know what?
But it probably wasn't like a gaping open
Right.
bloody wound. It was probably like it looked healed as we would think of being healed, I think.
But he had to have those
That's what I
there
said today.
because none of them would have believed because
Yeah.
Thomas had to feel And then that's how they knew it was him.
Yeah.
And they believed he really did.
Yes.
And I think
So-
that's in Jesus' fashion. He
Yeah.
uses that to say, oh, okay, well, so you see and you believe.
Right.
Well, just praise
Right.
be to those who don't see
Yeah.
and still believe.
Mhm.
So I think that was sort of him calling them out and just saying, hey,
Yep.
blessed are those who don't see and believe.
Mhm. Yeah, good. Yeah, good questions. Good questions, all of them. I've thought of those myself at times, so.